Hey, my civic-minded citizens. Welcome to Unit 5 now for AP Gov. Isn't that amazing? We made it to Unit 5. And Unit 5 is all about political participation. So voting and parties blends really well with what we learned in Unit 4. Now, if you want a broader overview, on this YouTube channel, it says like Unit 5 review. This one goes more into the weeds and I break it down like by the subunits that the AP Gov people deemed exist. So let's start off in this video with 5.1, which is about voting rights and models of voting behavior. And also we'll get into 5.2, which is all about voter choice. All right, so let's get into this. So you guys know in the past that I've disagreed with some of the claims by the AP Gov powers that be. And if you're to look at their version of 5.1, they start off with the idea of we the people from the Constitution, and how do we make that work. And you know that through my studies, I've read and heard from enough professors to be reminded that the Constitution is not really about we the people. It's about the structure of our government. It's we the people of the United States, right? It's a pact of the states. If it was about the people, the Bill of Rights would have been in from the beginning. So I don't know if I agree with how they introduced this unit, but I think the main points they get into, the observations, do make lots of sense. All right. So they get into the fact that the Constitution was written by white male property owners. So therefore, those were the only people who were voting. That's true. They left voting, however, really to the states, which is what we know becomes an issue at point. So the thing that's important to pick up on is that over time, who's been eligible to vote has expanded. And when we refer to the electorate are the Americans who participate by voting, right? So many people could be electorates, but not everyone is an electorate. It's those people that actually vote that are. So let's first think of how has voting expanded. And there's three main ways. And the first way is by amendments. So there's 6 main amendments to know. And the first 3 are sort of grouped together, and then the second 3. So the first 3 are the 15th, 19th, and 26th. They also refer to this as a Civil War amendment. I think the common terminology is that the 15th was one of the Reconstruction amendments, right, as a result, after the Civil War. And this image here refers to the 15th Amendment. So that expanded voting rights, but what it basically did was allowed African American males to vote. That's significant, right? Then the 19th Amendment is what allowed women to vote, and the 26th Amendment changed the age to 18, right? Because think of all the people who could join the military yet still couldn't vote for years, right? I joined when I was 17, right? So I still couldn't even vote then, but something to think about. All right. And then we have another 3 amendments, the 17th, 23rd, and 24th. The 17th was about the direct election of senators so that the state legislatures weren't voting for senators. The 23 had to do with redistricting, so DC could vote in things like presidential elections. And the 24th, a really important one, also eliminated the poll tax, right? So you couldn't be like charged to vote, right? Because then that's not equitable. What if you can't afford to vote? Right. So the second way is through congressional legislation, and we'll look at a few of those here. And these are familiar to us. The first is the 1957 Civil Rights Act. And this addressed discrimination that existed at voting centers or in the attempt to vote. So this created offices that would address that. So it created the Office of Civil Rights. So it was part of the executive department. It mentions here the Department of Justice that empowered federal prosecutors to obtain court injunctions against interference with the right to vote. And President Eisenhower, Ike, we need to call him, West Point grad, he signed that into law. All right. And then we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We've talked about this already in Unit 3. And this prohibited prohibited discrimination, based on the basis of race, color, sex, or national origin. So it was basically an equal application of voter registration rules. And you see that here, this was LBJ that signed this one. And then right after, another one under LBJ. And we know these were uh, big they started to get momentum under JFK, but he was assassinated. I do have a book I was going to read about this, and I realized I'd make the video too long, so maybe I'll share some of you guys with it, you guys in class or later. Anyway, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This outlawed the discriminatory voting practices. A lot of Southern states after the Civil War did things like including literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting. So they usually weren't asking everyone. Usually it was like African Americans, like, oh, can you recite the Constitution? All right, things that people, like very few people, could do. And sometimes they would ask them questions, and if they got them right, they'd be like, oh, well, that's wrong, right? So, like, you can't have tests to like especially literacy tests, and especially think of the few generations after the Civil War. Think of slaves being not allowed in many states to be taught how to read or write. Think of the economic issues. Think of the segregated schools and why literacy tests would be so discriminatory. If you read the actual act, it means like no test or device. Like you can't have to like go through something to prove that you're eligible to vote, right? And then we also have SCOTUS decisions, two really big ones. So the artistry above is a reference to the 1915 court case Gwynn versus the United States, and this said no grandfather clause. So what this meant was, in Oklahoma, there could be a literacy test, but you could be grandfathered in, right, to not have to take the test. But if you're new at voting, then you would have to take the test. So in other words, like now that more people could vote, right, it it made it harder for them. So basically, it was like an excuse for whites to go through without having to take this test, to act like they're not being discriminatory. They're just grandfathered in. That was Oklahoma's attempt. And the Supreme Court said, no, not so fast. And then another case is 1944, Smith versus Allwright. This is Lonnie Smith over there to the left that sued. This was in Texas. There was a Democratic Party law that was basically saying the primaries could be white only, right? Because primaries are left to the party to run, right? So it wasn't like it was a federal or even really thing here. And the Supreme Court said, no, we don't care if it's up to the primaries, like the parties can't do this. So it said it violated the 14th Amendment in the Equal Protection Clause. All right, so now let's move on. Now that voting rights have expanded and more people can vote, does that mean that there's now greater voter turnout? Not always. All right, there are more voters now that say women can vote and African Americans can vote. Now that 18-year-olds can vote, but it really hasn't gone up proportionately as expected. And why is that? There's a few expected or suspected reasons. I'll go back. One, it's done state by state, and states have different rules and laws. What about voting that happens during the workday, which makes it hard for a lot of these newly able people who can now vote to vote? Some states don't let convicted felons vote. So just all these things that are still make it obstacles for people to vote. And when we saw the Voting Rights Act attempt, the newest one attempt to go past this year, we saw some of these things mentioned. So let's look at 4 voter models. So now once people can vote, how do they usually decide who they're going to vote for? And there's 4 main models that political scientists look at. And one is rational choice. So we're going to bring back our friend Madison for this. All right, with rational choice model, it's you look at all the information, right? And you evaluate it. and you say, which one is more likely to benefit me? Now, you might look at what's more going to benefit the country. That rarely happens. Now, our founders optimistically thought many voters would vote for what's best for the country. Um, Remember, the voting pool was also smaller then, but that's not really the case. Usually you vote on, well, what's going to best help my interests? Then you have party line voting. You just have political party loyalty. You might not even know who's running, but you see Republican and you're a Republican, or you see Democrat or you're a Democrat, or Green Party or whatever, and you just bing, bang, 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 boom. It doesn't matter if that person has scandals, doesn't matter about their track record. You're just going to be loyal to your party. A big predictor of this is um, registering with a party. If you are a registered voter to a party, you're more likely to vote this way. The third one is retrospective voting. I tried to give Madison a retro hat, but unfortunately, it makes it difficult for Madison to see. So, retro, right? Think the past. So, you're looking to the past, right? So, you look at the candidate's track record. How have they voted in the past? What bills or, you know, legislation have they tried to create in the past? How did they exist as in their former office? And you try to make information saying, based on that, how well do you think they'll do in the future? Sometimes you also do retrospective voting based on how the party has done in the past. So keep that in mind as well. And lastly, we have prospective voting. So think of like you're making a pinky promise here. What do these politicians promise they will provide to you? What do you see in the future? You anticipate what might happen. The promises made and how you think it's going to impact your life moving forward. Can you also sort of blend some of these? Sure, right? None of this exists in a silo. All right, so now let's think of what influences voting behavior. And this is very similar to a lot of the like political socialization we've learned about, but that deals a lot with your ideology. Now, what's going to make the decision when you're in the voting booth? And one is party loyalists. Loyalists. You look at the competence of the candidate, but also the views of the party. So, usually people will be pretty, if you feel like you're loyal to a party, you'll be pretty consistent with that. All right. Also, candidate's character does matter. Sometimes you might look at elections and be like, does it really matter? But sometimes it does. And a big election coming in terms of this was the 2016 election, which was Trump versus Hillary Clinton. And a lot of people didn't like the character of either candidate. And you see this chart here from the Pew Research Center. Few voters associated positive words and phrases with Clinton or Trump. You hear like the best of two evils. That's not to say that there weren't people who really were positive for either one, because there were, but you just saw this a lot with that election. And then we have important political issues. Many people will vote based on just what's really important to them. And traditionally, the top one is anything to do with the economy, and the second one is actually things that deal with religion. But in the 2020 election that just passed, we have the economy again at the top, and then we have healthcare. Keep in mind, 2020 election, what's going on at the time, COVID, right? Supreme Court appointments, that's because there was just several, actually many, compared to most times, put in by the Trump administration. And then the coronavirus, obviously. So you're not going to see that in prior polls. Um, all right. Now let's talk about voter turnout. I wanted to mention, okay, no, this is fine. So what then is going to impact voter turnout? If a lot of people aren't voting, why? And what can we do about that? And two things to look at are both voter apathy and voter alienation. If you don't know what apathy means, you should go look that up. Good SAT word. And voter turnout was probably highest in the late 19th century. So think, what hundreds is that? Hmm. And what we have as a nation, one of the lowest voter turnouts in modern democracies. Now, I think since the AP people put this together, some things have changed with the 2020 election. We saw the big voter turnout with like Stacey Abrams led in the South. Um, so, there are some differences with this. But voter apathy is like, my vote doesn't count, right? I have no desire to vote. Like, doesn't matter, right? Voter alienation is like you feel alienated, right? You know you should vote, but you don't. You feel like you're underrepresented in the government, that your vote is insignificant. It's not going to make a difference. So there's other factors that keep people from voting. What about voter registration? Okay, most states you have to register 30 days in advance. What if it's like day 28 and you're like, oh crap, now I can't vote, right? They tried to change that with the motor voter law, which we'll talk about later. What about ID laws, right? Some states are like, oh, just bring in a bill that shows you live here and you can register. But what if you need a government issued ID? Not everyone has that. Not everyone can easily get one. It also may cost money. So is that like a poll tax in a way? Also, there's election day issues. Maybe do you just have an emergency in your life that day, or maybe you look at lines and you're like, I can't wait in that. I have to go to work. I have to make money, right? Um, so many times there's long lines. Average is 14 minutes. I've never had to wait very long, but 5% of all voters that vote were wait in lines for over 2 hours, right? Who's going to watch your kids during that time, right? Things to think about. Also, the hours of operation. What if it closes by 6 and you just get done at 5:30 and you can't for work and you can't get there in time? Some places are later. What if it doesn't open super early, right? So things to keep in mind. And I will say with voter ID laws, there's 35 states require some sort of ID, government ID. And there was a 2013 case, Shelby versus Holder, that reinforced that, like, yeah, that's constitutional. They can make you have an ID, but you still hear it debated a lot. So let's look at some attempts to correct that. You have the 1993 Voter Registration Act, which is often referred to as the Motor Voter Law. This was signed in when Bill Clinton was president. So basically, if you go to the motor vehicles agency to register your car, you're also going to be given information to register to vote. And it did increase the amount of registered voters, but it really didn't increase voter turnout. It's like if they weren't registered to vote then and they weren't voting then, it's not going to influence them to vote now. You also have the Help America Vote Act, HAVA. This picture is sort of weird, but notice this is 2002. This was after the 2000 election, which took a while before they knew the winner because it was hard to read, especially some of the ballots in different states, like Florida. You hear this phrase, hanging chads. And that was to try to make more national standards. So even though states still have their own protocols, it tried to make it so that less mistakes were made. It also meant people with disabilities and made it easier for them to vote. Because of this, 75% of states changed the way they vote in one way or the other. However, because of this, some then instituted requiring IDs. So in a way, it sort of backfired because it actually made it harder for some people to vote. All right. Now we look at things like absentee ballots or the ability to early vote. Interestingly enough, these AP videos were made before the 2020 election and everything that happened with changing some of the policies due to the coronavirus. But by 2012, 1/3 of all voters voted before election day. So it was already a thing in many places. Different states have different rules about that. 16 states say like you need like a legit reason for an absentee ballot. You can't just say I want to vote absentee ballot. You may have to prove you have an illness. You may have to prove you're going to be traveling out of the state that day. Prove you can't get out of work that day. Things like that. By 2020, 46%. Right, this is the 2020 election, 46% mailed, voted by absentee or mail-in ballots, which is a huge percentage, but remember, coronavirus. 2016, absentee ballots were 23.5%. So you see like the changing figures. All right, and then we'll finish up with voter choice. Who are the people that vote, and why do they vote? Women tend to vote democratically. Men tend to vote Republican. As we said, these are generalizations. This might just be a little bit more than half because there's plenty of female Republicans and there's plenty of male Democrats. By age, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. Senior citizens vote in much higher percentages. And think about that. As politicians know that older people are more likely to vote, who are they more likely to make legislation for? People that will support them. So if younger people want more issues that address them, they need to vote more, right? Think about that. Then we look at religion. Evangelical Christians, right? So these are not like Christians as a whole, but evangelical Christians, often referred to as the religious right. They're more likely to vote Republican/conservative. Catholics are more likely to vote democratically. I think we've only had 2 Catholic presidents, JFK and Biden. They're both Catholic. Jews have a much higher voter turnout, and they tend to vote democratically. Now, the AP videos did not include the percentages of our Muslim voters. And I was like, it just started Ramadan. So like, I can't ignore that. So I looked up the figures. 18% of Muslims in the United States consider themselves conservative. 51% consider themselves moderate, and 31% consider themselves liberal. Most voted for Biden in the past election. However, and this is also interesting, 65% of all Muslim Americans support the Black Lives Matter movement, which is the highest of all religions in the United States. So the more you know, people. All right. Then we look at race and ethnicity. What issues tend to matter to certain races as opposed to others? African Americans tend to vote more democratically. So do Hispanics. But think of like how broad that is, right? It's really dangerous when we create these huge generalizations, because if you look at Cuban Americans tend to vote more conservatively. Asian Americans have the smallest percentage of ethnic voters, and they sort of split liberal and conservative issues because they want less regulation of businesses in general, which is more of a conservative ideal, but they also want more protection for civil liberties, which is more of a liberal idea. So remember, everyone is capable for thinking and voting for themselves. Regardless, race and diversity has increased in the voting booth by 1990. So that's trend to go up. So I have these graphs here. So you see to the left by the Pew Research Center, racial and ethnic diversity among U.S. voters has grown steadily since 1990. I would love to see an updated one, because with the movement to get voter registration increased in places like Georgia, I'd like to see the 2020 numbers. And you'll see that voter turnout did increase a little bit. So that's good for 2018 above. All right. I know this was sort of long, but it's good information. All right. We're going to continue with our next video, which is going to be about linkage institutions. Yes. All right. So go learn, go be a good civic minded people.